All right. So so we'll make sure anybody that has not been able to install SASS, I can help you troubleshoot that on your computer. But that's obviously step one. And I also put in Canvas a link to the SASS website where you can get more information on it. And basically, just to give you a overview of what SASS is it's a compiler for CSS. So it takes your CSS code that you can write more advanced techniques and compile that to regular CSS. So there's several languages. I think one of them is called Less. This one's SASS. SASS has same thing like Bootstrap. It's very popular. It's so popular that Bootstrap changed the language they were using CSS over to SASS. And also a lot of other, all the companies that I've worked for, they use SASS. So knowing SASS is, will make you more employable for sure. Yeah, so a lot of companies use it, a lot of developers use it. So there's a lot of support. So any issues you might have, if you just Google them, you're definitely gonna find solutions for it. But knowing how to write SASS, knowing how it works, what it does is very, very helpful. One big thing to note is that when you write SASS or in the way their language works, it's very similar to CSS, but anything that's part of SASS, when you write that, you need to compile it. That's a big concept there. So like you write CSS, and I'm going to show you. So obviously we're going to go through it, but once you write it, you're going to run a command line to compile your file, your SCSS file, to regular CSS, because browsers like Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari, those cannot read SASS. They can only read CSS. So that's one big thing to make sure that when you're pointing to a CSS file, you need to make sure it's CSS and not your SCSS file. And cool. So in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and this is something similar to what you guys should have, which is you should have an index.html file with something that looks, well, I know that you guys styled it, but right before you guys personalized it, this is what it mostly looked like. And from here, you should have a CSS directory. Is this too small, or you guys can see my screen?
I can see it.
I can see it too.
Cool. Great. So you should have a CSS directory. One thing too that I've been noticing on several students is that you didn't use like your image directory to put all your photos. So one thing to make sure is that all your images should definitely be in some kind of image directory. And then you should probably have a CSS folder that you created when you personalized your WordCamp conference website. You should have already created a CSS folder. And the new thing we're going to do is you're going to create a new folder and call it SCSS. So this is where your SASS files will be right here. And then again, your file, probably you called it something like styles.css, right? So this is probably what you had. And what we're going to do is move that over to your SCSS, this new directory. So we're going to want to move that. I'm going to move that to the SCSS directory. So now it's moved there. And the next thing you're going to want to do is to rename that file to styles.scss. So you can name your file anything you want. It could be like my styles, .css, whatever. But the important piece is to make sure that the extension of that file is SCSS. So that's one big thing right here. So now at this point, we should have the new directory with this new file and an empty CSS directory. Great. So now to run SASS, we use our command line or our terminal window. And here we're gonna do, so I don't know how many of y'all are on Windows, but it's very similar. So you're gonna do change directory, which is CD and then a space. And then I'm gonna go to my directory where all my files are at for the repository. In this case, it's in this GitHub directory, and then I called it MVC WordCamp. And what I wanna do is I wanna change directory to that directory, not to my SCSS. Just to the main one, to the main repository URL or directory. So I'm going to drag that there, and notice how I don't have to type it in. It just types it in for me, and I hit enter. And at this point, I'm at the terminal or command line is in the level of that WordCamp repository directory. So I can do whatever I want. So since I have SASS installed, I can run the command, and the command is here in the SASS website. So I want to do, it's a little easier one. So I'm going to do SASS space -- watch space. And here you could type this in, but there's an easier way. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do SASS space -- watch. And then I'm going to type in the directory name for my SASS, which is SCSS. And then a colon, and then where it's going to compile to. So this is where it's going to. So in this case, I want it to go to the CSS directory, just like that. So when I do that, you guys remember that I created a folder called CSS, and it was an empty folder. But now that I started running it, this is what SASS does for me. It creates the compiled version, which is this styles.css, and a map, a .map file. A map is basically how to, if you have multiple files of style sheets, you can it can map it out for you. That's something more advanced, but the important piece is to know that that command line is watching this file, this SASS file, and anytime you save changes, it will overwrite this file. So if you make a change to this file and then run SASS, it will overwrite it. So basically this directory, you should leave alone at this point. Any questions so far, or everybody's understanding? Cool. Okay, and you guys can stop me too at any time. Okay. So yeah, so that's how you basically run SASS. It's like very easy. There's applications that do this for you, but I found that it's not that bad. You know, I've been doing web development for more than 15 years, and to this day I don't like using terminal or command line as much. But I know people that that love it. That's like they move around very quickly. So I definitely try to stay away. But for SASS, it's definitely one of the easiest ways that I found. So just because all you got to do is run that command line and then just leave it. Every time you make a change to your file, it will overwrite it for you. Okay, so that's how you run it. Now it created that file, but now my website doesn't know that file exists. So I have to make sure that my HTML knows where that's at. So I'm going to go ahead and link it. And you guys probably already did something like this. So I'm going to do link rel style sheet. And I'm going to do styles.css. So I want to link it to the styles.css. That. Make sure there's no errors. Cool. Oh. Yeah, there you go. That's the first error. So it's in a CSS directory. Okay, So now I found the file. Obviously nothing's happening because it's empty, right? Okay. So at this point I have my index.html file and my styles.scss file, which is my styles or SASS file. One of the biggest advantages of that separates SASS from just writing regular CSS is variables. Does any of y'all know what variables are?
That's like in JavaScript too, right?
Yes, JavaScript has variables.
I've heard the term before.
Okay. Cool. So yes, variables are used in JavaScript. You know, it's a language, right? So there, all server-side languages have variables. So like PHP, WordPress, which is built on PHP, Java. I mean, you name it. All server-side languages, when it comes to programming, use variables. So it's a very you know, open keyword, you know, so it's not anything specific to SASS. So variables are basically placeholders where you can store information. So you can do things like, and to create a variable, let me see, make sure that yeah. So here in the SASS guide, so the link that I put on Canvas, you can read more about it here. But the idea here is that to create a variable, you use the $sign. And again, you're going to notice this on many server-side languages, how they create variables. So you do a $sign, and then you put in a name for it. So you can name it whatever you want. In this case, they use font-stack and then a colon. And same like the way you set values for CSS, for like when you put a color or something like that, you set a value of what you want that variable to hold. So in this case, we're gonna go ahead and put in, well, first we're gonna do a comment. So I'm gonna say variables. And then I'm gonna do color, primary, and actually have one here. And I'm actually gonna, so another thing too is that when you run any type of programming, you might run into conflicts with naming variables. Same thing with JavaScript. You might be overriding a variable for a different application or a plugin or script or something like that. So sometimes you want to make them more personalized. So in this case, since we're working on a WordCamp project, I'm gonna pre-fill it as WC-color primary. And then I'm gonna use this blue color, color blue, and 381 3C2. Okay, so this is the variable I put, and this is the hex value set a values to that variable. So now a quick way to just make things look good is I'm gonna apply that color to the background. So I'm gonna say body. And I'm gonna, instead of setting the hex value, I'm gonna go ahead and set that value with the variable. So I'm gonna say background color, like that. And now if I save that, and I go back to my command line, you're gonna see every time you hit save, it's just gonna tell you what happened. If at any point you hit save and there's an error, this will tell you that there was an error. That's what's really handy about it. So now I'm gonna go back to the website, and I have a blue background. So that's using that variable. So obviously I couldn't do this with regular CSS. All right, and then another thing too is we're gonna be creating, or basically converting this layout, right? So like this is our prototype design that we received to create our conference website. And make it look more trendier, so something like that. So that's why that I'm using that blue background there for something like that. And another, let me see what's the next. Yeah. Another, I guess, big catch, another big feature about using SASS is being able to nest things. So a lot of times you have to define your styles to a specific element. So you have to like call every bit, every path of that element, and then define the styles for it. And if you have something similar to it or something inside of it, you have to keep kind of going through that path. And I'll give you an example of that. So I'm going to go to the nav bar. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to change this color to that blue color here, the main one, using that variable. And normally to do that without, just with pure CSS, we would have to do something like this. We would say nav bar. And also to identify the element, you can always right click it, hit inspect, and notice that the class is, here we go. The main class is navbar, so that's the main one. And you always want to kind of like go from the top down. So there's my main class, navbar. But the element that I'm trying to get is this nav link. That's the one that we're trying to get there. So an easy way to get there is just saying navbar, nav link. And then we can say color, and we use our variable. And this should actually work, I think. Let's see. Might have to remove some classes here. 1 second. All right. I'll go ahead and explain what I did there. But that style that I did went ahead and overrid the color of the nav links to that blue. But instead of doing this, the best way with SASS is to nest them. So just like you nest your HTML, right? So you have your nav element, it closes here. You nest a div with a class container inside of it, it closes here. All of these elements are nested within each other. The same concept. So with SASS, you could do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and open and close navbar class and nest more classes within it. In this case, we want to be a little bit more specific. So I'm going to add and navbar light. And let me refresh this. Okay. Does anybody know why I use the and symbol here? So this is my nav element.
I don't.
Okay. Is everybody the same? Doesn't know why? So no, it's not for both. Okay. So the reason why we use the and symbol is because, so when you nest classes, that means that the child element or the child class you're specifying is in fact a child. if you use the and symbol, that means it's at the same level. So that means that navbar class and navbar lite have to be at the same level. So navbar and navbar lite are in fact in the same level. So notice how the text is blue, right? If I don't do this and symbol there, this, of course, this will actually not work. So it's going to go back to gray. That is because SASS is thinking that navbar lite is a div inside of navbar. So there should be another navbar lite element with that class name. Got it. Cool. So that's why we need this and symbol. This is very helpful when you have, and when we get through it, I don't know how much time we'll have, but I'm already seeing we're already at 125. When you have multiple things like the speaker section, you're gonna wanna apply the same, most of the same styles to all of those repetitive, what do you call it, components. But sometimes you wanna set one apart and you're gonna add a class to that, and you're probably gonna use this and symbol to identify that specific one. So this is very handy. So cool. So that's that. There's still like another layer I wanna add just to be more specific. And notice how I'm indenting, and same concept with your HTML. You definitely want to make sure that all your code is structured as best as possible. Okay, cool. So now we're gonna add another variable, and we're gonna call this one pink. And this value is C13. And what we're gonna do is, so notice how our nav, when I scroll, this no longer changes, right? Like it's no longer bold or whatever. So to do that, I can kind of go through this, my nav. And you're gonna see here the class change from nav link to having another class called active. So as I scroll, you're gonna see it change. And that's because Bootstrap has JavaScript that does that for us without having to write JavaScript. It does that for us. So, but now we have a class to identify, and we can do that, or we can attach to that using SASS. So I'm gonna hit nav link, and because it's at the same level, right? So nav link and then active. So we're gonna say active, and we're gonna say, I want this color to be pink. Now let's refresh that. Kind of goes in. So you can do all kinds of crazy things, but you kind of get the concept of, so if we ever want to change that blue to something else or a different shade of blue, very easy just to change in one spot. So, yes, yeah, SASS is very, very helpful. Also, as a designer, it makes things a lot more fun to work around because you have so many possibilities to work with. Cool, so that's that. All right, the next thing we're gonna work on, let me see. Well, let me see, it's already 1:30. How much time more do you guys have that way I can see like what I can continue working on? Do y'all have like another 30 minutes or like a few minutes?
I have a hard stop at 2.
Okay, cool. Great. Awesome. Okay, so then I'll make sure that I do as much till 2, and then anybody that can stay longer, we can go through some questions and stuff like that. All right, so put that in. Okay. So another thing too that has nothing to do with SASS, but I'm just gonna I'm gonna be using Google fonts for the website. Has anybody used Google fonts before?
I did in one of my classes.
Awesome. Okay. Nice. There you go. Okay. Good. All right. So the one that I like using just for very generic font is called Roboto. Like it's even here, like #1. So they have obviously a library of fonts you can use, and the cool thing is that you can just link to that font, and it imports the font family. So it imports like from the very light version of it to the very bold version of it. So that's what's really cool about it. So I'm gonna copy their code that they mentioned. I'm gonna add it to our code. So now it should be importing, and now I'm able to use it. And they even tell you what to do if you want to use it. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that. And I wanna make all our heading tags that font. So I'm gonna say H1, H2, like that. So it shouldn't make a huge difference, but you'll probably notice a little bit the heading tags, how they changed a little bit. Great. And I think we're gonna start structuring our HTML a little bit better. Okay. So our Jumbotron is the next piece that I wanna focus on. So we want to get it from looking like this to something more full that covers. What I wanted to do is cover the full height of the screen. And we use there's with regular CSS you don't need SASS for this, but you can say the visual height and visual width. So it's like VH or VW. You can use those values to define height and width. So we want to do that with this hero section here. So I'm gonna go to our Jumbotron section, which is here. And one change that I want to do is I'm gonna start breaking these sections up into sections. So right now they're just divs. So I'm gonna say section, and I'm gonna close it the same. And I'm gonna remove this BG Light class. And let's see, I don't need padding anymore. And as you start styling your HTML with CSS, you're also going to notice you can add padding and margins yourself instead of using Bootstrap's classes. So that's also things that you'll probably be doing afterwards. And I'm going to change this one to light. And this one to info. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to create another section for Jumbotron. And that's my class name. And I'm gonna start nesting within it. So one of the things that I want to do is the min height. So that's the minimal height I want. And there's gonna be I'm gonna create two values for this. And the reason why is because of past browsers that do not support aligning things in the middle, which I'm gonna do with this section. So I have to do min height 100%, and then min height And this is the one that's very helpful. So virtual 100 virtual height. Or sorry, visual height. And we're going to use display flex. And the reason why we're going to use flex is because we want to align, since this section right here is going to be the full height of my screen, I want to align these elements in the middle. And if you look up CSS, flex, and all that, you're going to see all the cool things you can do with flex. So in this case, I want to align line items center. And I want to have a background color as transparent. And I'm going to add an image that I have here. It's called pattern geometric. And notice that this image is an SVG file. Does any of y'all know or have worked with SVGs for websites?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. SVGs are really great when it comes to patterns, logos. When you're going to add a logo to a website, definitely do your best to find the SVG version of it, or basically it's a vector file. But in order to read it, for a browser to read it, it needs to be an SVG file. And I believe it wasn't not too long ago that, all modern browsers adapted it. Chrome is always the first ones to allow, they're more progressive when it comes to new techniques. So Chrome was definitely up there. But if you attach an SVG file in Internet Explorer or view the website in Internet Explorer, it wouldn't work. You had to add a script to convert it and all that. It was all crazy. But now today, all modern browsers can see a SVG file. And the big difference between an SVG file and you put up a PNG or JPEG file side to side is that the vector file or the SVG file is going to be a lot crisp, clear, especially when it comes to logos and all that. It just looks a lot better. So that always helps stand out. Versus if you create a PNG file that's very little, it's going to look pixelated depending on the screen, especially on a Mac that has I don't even know what the screens are called now, but they're Retina displays and all that, where you can really see how bad a website looks with these new screens. So SVG is super helpful when it comes to those kind of that when you use those techniques, right, to obviously make things look better. So I'm going to say background image URL. And if anything that I'm writing doesn't make sense, y'all feel free to stop me. Right now, specifically, I'm not doing anything that's SASS related, but this is going towards converting that site over to more modern look. And notice how, if you ever do this with CSS, you usually would do with PNG or JPEG or something like that. So there's nothing different. It's still an image file. Now I'm going to do a background repeat. We want it to repeat since it's a pattern. And this is the location, the position. We want it to be centered. Attachment. I want this to scroll. Background size. We're going to do auto. And for, I'm going to add this Z index because I'm going to be layering stuff in a little bit. Has anybody used Z index or do y'all need me to expand on what Z index is? Okay. Cool. So when it comes to writing CSS, especially when you're going to do these modern designs that overlap each other, because you definitely want that, right? You don't want to create, very, you don't want to, when you create designs for websites, you want to stand out. And when you start doing things like what magazines do and cool print banners, things like that, how they design that, all that stuff is possible to do with websites today. 15 years ago, it was very difficult. But now you have all the technology, and the most important thing is that browsers support it now. So you can do a lot of really cool things. So being able to overlap things and that's very crucial. You should definitely practice a lot. So in this case, z-index is a key ingredient of that, which is you can actually layer, just like in Photoshop, you have a layer at the very bottom and a layer at the very top. So the one that's at top is always going to be the one that comes out on top. So z-index helps you to do that. So you can write z-index negative integers, so like -1, -1,000, or you can do positive numbers, so like z-index 1,000. Notice that there's no px, so it's not pixels, these are just levels. So you would just put in a number and not a pixel value. So you just do an integer. In this case, we want 0 value for this. And I'm gonna add some margin to the bottom of this. I'm gonna do 5. All right. See how that looks. Okay. So doing that, as you can see, this Jumbotron section is now full width. Sorry, not full width. Well, it is full width, but it takes full height of my screen, only to my screen. So if I were to see this on a larger device or monitor, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to adapt. That's what this value, 100%, not 100%, but 100 virtual height does. That's what that does. Yes. So things like if you want, it's kind of like percent, but the big difference is that when you use percentage, you're not gonna get the correct value all the time. It might work for your browser, but when you start testing, that's another big thing about this industry is that you have people that their job, like their full job, is to just review what you did as a designer or a developer, and they're the quality assurance department. So all they do is, like, after you design, after you develop, they go and they check everything out on all the modern browsers, on Internet Explorer, on phones, tablets, everything. They go and check everything out. So yes, it might look good for you, but when it goes through QA, you get it sent back like, hey, like it looks really bad on this screen. And that's because, again, it's experience and it's like learning what works and what doesn't. So yes, I could probably do this, and let's find out. No, I didn't. You see, that didn't even work. But sometimes you get away with percentage, sometimes you don't. So that's why knowing these little tricks helps. Again, it's experience, so you're not gonna just take it to heart right now and know it forever. But it's just as time goes and you do this more often, you're gonna know like what works and what doesn't. All right. So the next thing I'm gonna target in this Jumbotron is the container. So I have my Jumbotron and then I have my container element here. So I'm gonna nest that in there. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually add a layer to it. So I'm gonna say z-index 1. So that's gonna be above the background, right? I'm gonna make sure all the text inside of it is white. And I have the heading tag inside that, so I'm gonna say h1. So I'm nesting another element within my container. And I want it to be white as well. I might be able to get rid of that one, but we'll see right now. I'm gonna add font weight to 800. My font size, I'm gonna use 10 rem. line height, I'm gonna use 10 rem. And text transform uppercase. I'm gonna add some margin to the bottom. I'm also gonna do a line break. So I'm gonna do a BR right here. Cool. So now I have my heading tag, very prominent, very, again, like it's a trend now to like have these, these huge, lettering and concepts for your designs. Did it do the white? Okay, cool. So I actually don't need this color white anymore. It did both of these. All right. So now you guys see this right here? It just ends in an ugly way, right? So you just like, this pattern just like ends right here. So there are several ways to take care of that. You can create a new photo that has a gradient on it. You can do like a drop shadow. I don't know. You can do a lot of crazy things. What we're gonna do is we wanna have this smooth transition using a gradient to that. So in order to do that, have you guys used the before and after classes to CSS? Like something like this.
I haven't.
Cool. All right. So using the before and after is a really cool trick for CSS. You don't need this with SASS, but again, it's very helpful with SASS because you're able to indent it so you know what element you're identifying. So in this case, we're gonna target the Jumbotron, and we're gonna say and after. And essentially what's really cool about before and after is that you can, it's like you're creating another div, but without writing code. So I could have done something like this, like div class gradient, right? And then instead of doing and after, I could say something like and gradient, and then I can do whatever I want here. But instead of doing this, instead of writing HTML, you can do this. You can add before and after elements to your element. So in this case, I'm going to add an after element to Jumbotron. Really helpful and really cool stuff. In order to see it, you have to type in content. And you can actually write HTML in here. So just for the heck of it, I'm just saying, that way you guys can see it. See that right there? That's what I put in. So you can do things like an icon and things like that. You can do all kinds of stuff with that. So that's without writing any HTML. Sometimes when you're taking on projects with web development, you don't have the ability to edit HTML. For example, a project comes in and you're working with like some company that they already have the HTML or already created. Your job specifically is only to make it look good. That's your job. And they don't have the ability for you to go in because they have a very complicated back end that generates the HTML, and it's just not possible to create that extra div that you wanted. So what do you do in those scenarios? Well, what's really cool is you can do these things with just CSS. So in this case, we don't want any text. We just want just an empty content. And we're going to say display block. And I'm going to do an absolute positioning. So I'm sure you guys already know, or do you guys know about absolute positioning? I feel like y'all should.
That one I know.
Okay, cool. Yes, so yeah, so we're gonna position that absolute. And now, when you, obviously, if you guys have worked with absolute position, you have to state where it's at on the top and the left of where the element, what element is relative to. So in this case, it's relative to Jumbotron. And we want the gradient down here, not up here. So how do we know, since the height is dynamic, right? It's going to adapt to every screen. So how do we know how many pixels it's from the top to the bottom? The answer is you don't know. So another really great CSS technique is to calculate that. So all you do is do calc, and the height that we have in the Jumbotron is 100 virtual height. And I'm going to say minus 10 REM. Basically, that's saying that calculate this height minus 10 REM, which should be around here. That basically puts our new div around this area. And that's what we want. We want the gradient to transition this pattern to this blue. So we want it to start above it and not below it. This is very, very helpful. Probably very underused from working with teams. Width, height, and this is the height I chose just from working with it. And then here comes the Z index. So in this case, we want 1. So we want it right above the Jumbotron, that background pattern. We want it right above it. So that's where that's at. And the next thing is we want that gradient. So I'm gonna say background image. And there's tons of websites that can create a gradient for you. So for example, I'm just gonna Google CSS gradient generator. That's an ugly one. So anyway, so you can kind of design your gradient, and this will actually output what you want right here for you. But in this case, I already know what I want, so I'm gonna go ahead and type it out. So linear gradient, 180 degrees. What about the alpha channel with RGB? Have y'all used RGBA?
Yes.
Yep, okay, cool. And this is where it's going to start. So that's where the first color, the gradient's going to start. So that color is going to start at 0. And the next color is this. Great. So now if I save this, I have this nice transition. So let me inspect that before. Notice how it moved up because the screen got smaller. So let me do it on the right side to look better. Okay, so here's my after element that I created. So if I were to change this to like background, you can notice it more. This is essentially, that's the outline of what I created. So it's just a better transition. Cool. Now these buttons, they're very, so Bootstrap automatically has these rounded corners, and I have the button large class to it. So I want to make that look better, more towards what the design that I want. So I'm going to create another section in my SASS file. I'm going to call button. And the class is btn. And I'm going to say border radius 0. So that means anytime I use a button, I don't want that rounded corner to it. So you can see it applied here, here. So all the buttons are now squared. And that's what I want. So the next thing I want is I want to add more padding to these larger buttons. So I'm going to say button LG because that's a class to make that a larger button with Bootstrap. And I'm going to add custom padding to it. So that's top and bottom, I want 1 rem, and then left and right, I want 2 rem. Cool. All right. So that's the hero section. We're gonna go ahead and start this about section. And same concept what we did with the Jumbotron, I'm gonna convert it to HTML to a section using that section tag. And I'm basically gonna break it away from the main container. So if you notice, everything in our content is in our that main container. So I'm gonna get rid of, I'm gonna remove it from that one. And I'm gonna start creating a section. I'm gonna call it class section about. And I'm gonna I'm gonna add an ID equals about. And I still want this to be inside of a container. So I'm basically gonna reuse that div. And I'm gonna move this to the right. And notice how I'm, again, making very important importance to make sure that everything is indented as best as possible. So I can know where things start and where they end. So here's my about, here's the section, here's the div container, and here's my row. I don't need this ID here anymore, so because I added above here, so I'm gonna remove it from there. And now I need to close the new div and section tags. So now it's there. So this doesn't do anything visually, right? So if I go here, it still looks the same, but now I have a good way to connect to all these elements with this section about. Let's see what else. And then another thing that I'm gonna add is I want to connect to these specific columns, and they all use the same class. So it's call LG, call LG, call LG. So what can I do to identify these specifically? Does anybody know? Yeah, so like if I were to want to say, I want a pink background to this column, a white background to this one, what can I do? You could do an ID, but with CSS, I would stay away from IDs. So close. So if I rename them, if I rename them, then that means that they're not columns anymore because we need these classes. So we need these classes there. So the best way to do it is not to rename them, but add a class. And what I like to use is what it is. So in this case, it's a column, right? So I'm gonna say call. And then I usually add I hyphenate it, so call. And then I'm gonna say about, because this is the about. I know it's within the about section, but it's another call about. And then this one is the speakers. And then this last one is the topics. So now I have my main section, right? Section about. And now I have a class to identify each column. And the reason why I say I prefix it with call or like a column is because it is a column. Same thing with this. I use section because it's a section. So naming convention is very important. It's super useful. I know that right now you're working individually, but when you're working with teams, and or also 6 months down the line, or even 3 months down the line, when you need to come back to this project to make changes, you're gonna thank yourself that you did that, or your team member that they did it because they made your life easier. I think that's good. Okay, so I'm gonna. Okay. So I'm gonna start with section about. Okay. In this case, we want to add. We want to make this section relative for child element. So I'm gonna say position relative. So if you guys already did absolute positioning, you understand why we use that. I'm going to reuse that Z index. I'm going to say 2. And can anybody already see why I'm using a 2 for this? Or why I valued a 2? Nope, crickets. All right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we use 1 for the Jumbotron and also that gradient. So if we didn't use the value 2, that means the gradient will be right above the text. So yes, you're right. Add some margin to the bottom. And now I'm going to start identifying those columns that we talked about. So the first one is the about column. I'm going to say padding top, 1 REM, padding bottom. The text is going to be white. And I'm going to do the same concept as our gradient, but in this case, I'm going to do it before because I want the element to be before it. So I'm going to say and before position absolute content. It's an empty content. Width, I'm going to calculate the width. I'm going to say 100% plus 1.7 REM. And then same thing with height. Say display block. And now I'm going to use the gradient, sorry, a variable value, and I want the pink background, so I'm going to use that variable we set up. I'm at a border radius, which is basically a rounded corners. And then now this this specific element, the before element, I'm gonna layer it underneath it. So I'm gonna say z index -1, and then top -1, left. And I'm gonna add a box shadow. And I want like a very you cannot see this drop shadow. So it's like 0.2 opacity. This is the opacity is from 0 to 10. Sorry, 0 to 1. Like that's not right. Cool. So if I go and check this, now I have this cool before element behind the div, the column. And I set the text white, and I added this cool padding around it. That way it's not too close to it. And the reason why I could have also like not done the before element, I could have just set the background pink to the column, something like this. I could have done that. But again, just trying to make things stand out and give it more depth to it. That's why I did the before element. So obviously it's just you experimenting and looking for different ways to do that. Next thing is we're gonna do the speakers section. I'm gonna add some padding to the right of the paragraph tags because right now they're like really close to it. So I'm gonna give it some spacing. And I'm also gonna make it a little, not as bright white. So I'm gonna remove some opacity to it, maybe 6. And I'm also gonna do the and before concept. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this. And we're gonna say 3 REM and 1.7. We're gonna add a border with 3 pixels. We're gonna solid border and we want that pink color. We're gonna add, instead of being a border radius all around, we're gonna define only the top left radius and the bottom left. And we're gonna say z index 2, -2. So we want it behind that first one. And top 3 REM left. And this one we don't want a box shadow. Cool. So this is for our speakers column. And it comes out like that. So that's that border. Remember, we didn't do the border radius all around. We just did the top left and the bottom left. We made the text white, but give it some opacity to give it more visual to the heading, and also made sure that the text is not super close to the about section. All right, so let's finalize the topic section. We'll go ahead and copy this section and just kind of go through it. So call topics. Padding top is 4 REM. Yep. It goes behind the solid pin. Correct, yes. Yeah, Danielle, so exactly, we did -2, so it goes behind it, yep. So you could upload the practice file. Yeah, so once I'm done with this, whatever, I don't know how far we'll get, but wherever we end up, I have actually a repository that that I can link to and you can have access to, and obviously the video as well. But you'll have all of this code for sure. And also feel free to ask me questions. Like some of this is like things that you'll probably be experimenting with. So don't feel like you're stopping me or anything like that. This one has that heading, which we want to, so in this case, instead of the right being an issue, the issue is on the left side. So we're gonna add some margin to that heading tag. So we're gonna say margin left. Say 2 on here. Sorry, padding left. And we want that color pink for that. All right, the next thing is we have the list group, which is this one. And we want a margin left of 2 AM. And there's a nested class, which is the item. So it's list group item. And we don't want a border radius. So basically, we want to get rid of that radius around the corners. That's what that does. And here we want almost the same, or most of the same thing actually, but we want to add a background color and to be white instead of being transparent as the speaker section. Cool. Oh, that doesn't look good. So it's border right, top right, and bottom right. There you go. So big difference from, you know, where it was to, you know, where it's at. Now, what I want to do is probably for next week's workshop is animating these things. So, you know, just visually, I'm seeing like, you know, either these slide out from the middle or they're centered and they just like go down a little bit and this one goes up a little bit, like it shifts. So again, that animation sets your websites apart big time. Especially when they do it when you scroll. So that's another big thing. It's like when you're scrolling and it happens, that's the effect that you want, because then no one will see it. Cool, yes. So, okay, cool. So now let's do the speaker section. So this one, if you're looking at this, it looks kind of crazy. So you have like, you know, some layering going on. There's these waves here, right? So to accomplish that, I guess I'm probably going to start with the waves. So just like our pattern here, that is an SVG file, you can also, instead of using an SVG file, you can actually put SVG elements with code. So in other words, with HTML. So let me get that. I don't want to write all of this with you guys, so we're gonna have that. Yeah. So so same thing like we did with the about section, we're gonna break up the speaker section into its own section. So I'm gonna remove all of that code out of the container and make it its own. And we're also gonna have its own container inside of it. So it's gonna be section, speakers, ID, speakers. We can remove the ID from the H2 tag and make sure. Yeah, we don't need, we do not need, where's it at? Oh, here we go. We don't need these classes anymore because we're going to use CSS for that, for this heading tag. I'm going to indent all of this code a little bit so we know where it's inside of. I'm going to close that div and I'm going to close the section. So now it's very clear where everything starts and ends. Let me make sure, 1 second. Okay, so I'm gonna add that code. Right above this. Is it right above the container? Yeah. All right. Does anybody know, or can, so when you see this SVG file, does anybody know that what these files are made of, these SVG files? It's a big hint, by the way, here. No? Okay, so SVG files are basically paths. That's what they're made of. So if I go ahead and actually open this file, this pattern up here, see what I see? It's just code, right? That's all it is. So for simpler, how do I say it? I mean, that's super simple, but like icons and things like that, you can either create a SVG file like these are, or you can implement the SVG code like this is. So in this case, I found online this cool design of waves, and they had it in just HTML. So I went ahead and copied it and pasted it. The cool thing with SVG files is that something separate from pictures is that you can identify paths within it. Just like divs and tags, you can actually add classes to those paths. So in this case, I'm saying path, wave top. There's another group of paths called wave middle, and then wave end. Just like CSS on any tag that you apply to, you can add styles to that. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Right, let me make sure. Yeah, I think we're all good. And I'm going to go ahead, just to save time, I'm going to go ahead and copy that code. So what this does is just styles I created to make sure that that SVG stays in in the correct positioning where I want it, and also how you call it, like doesn't overlap things I don't want it to. So that's what all these styles are. And then the last thing is for that speaker section, I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this, and I'll just go over what we did. Okay. So just like the about section and the Jumbotron, I called it section speakers. I'm setting the background color to the pink. Here I'm targeting the SVG file, right? So here's my section speakers, and then right next, a child from that is the SVG file. So here's SVG. And then remember that I set 3 different classes. There's wave top, wave middle, and wave end. And what that does is that I'm setting a fill color. Notice that I can't say background color with SVGs and paths. You have to say fill. So, and then you can add a color to that. So here I want the wave top to be that color pink, our variable. And these are 2, and then the middle waves, I want it to be a little darker pink. So I'm not gonna use that. I'm not gonna reuse this color. So I didn't need to create a variable for it. And then the end ones, the ones at the very back, I'm using that pink again. Yeah, and then I'll just save it, and then I'll explain what these do. But this is basically that whole orientation that we're talking about for where things are overlapping each other and all that. So I'll explain that right now. So I'm gonna hit save. Oh, let's see, make sure I'm so card body. Oh, let's see. Oh, I thought I didn't go. Oh, there it is. Okay. Here it goes. No, I think it's there. Also, too, anytime you do mess up, it will actually, like, you won't see anything actually. Like, watch, let me show you. So if I were to not close one, it will tell you the issue, which is really cool. I think I'm missing like a class or something. Let me see. So speakers, where are you at? Here you go. Section speakers, container. Okay, so there's a row. Oh, let me see. I don't think I need this anymore. Oh, I know why. I added, so say you guys remember where we added column classes. So column, we say call speakers, call about, call topics. In my CSS, I specified card 1, card 3, card 4. So we need to add that. So here's card 1, card 2, card 3, card 4, card 5. Another way I could have done this is to like say their name, for example. I could say card Valk, you know, so I just made them integers. All right, here we go. So the reason, so yeah, so card 1, I gave it extra width with doing some margin techniques. I added background, what is it called? A drop shadow here to the pictures. And then the title, I did an absolute positioning. So it's up here. So if I remove the styles of the heading tag, so the heading tag is up here. So I made it, you know, bigger, like the way the Jumbotron was. So made it a lot bigger. And then I did an absolute positioning so that way it could be more towards the center. And then also I did some Z-index styles to these elements, to certain elements, to give that overlap effect. So like Tammy's like above the speaker's text heading tag, and then Drew's beneath it. So that's how I was able to achieve that. And then going back to the waves, remember these are the 3 paths that the SVG has, and I was able to do that. Another really cool stuff that you can do is you can animate these things. So like if you want like this wave to be like the top path to be moving to the right, and then the back one to be moving to the left, and then it just like loops, for example, you could do that now because they're all different paths. And if you wanted to change colors, or, you know, like you can do some crazy things with CSS now, which is really nice. And another big thing about SVG is that it's all vector. So like just like these border radius with CSS, they're not images. So you don't need any Photoshop. You don't need to add resources to people download, because people download code. They're not downloading images. So it makes the site very quick to load. And again, like just visually, this looks crisp on any monitor. So like high definition monitors like Mac computers and desktops and laptops, it looks really good. So that's also very important. Cool. So how much time we got? 26. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I think we should be able to finish the last piece. Are y'all good? Y'all have any questions? Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get to the next section. So we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna break out the schedule into its own section. So that way, so the bit, and then that way, just to be clear, the reason why I'm breaking them out of the container, and they're still gonna have a container, right? Because we still want them to be centered, but they're gonna have their own container within their section. And the reason why we want their own section is because we could do things like that, which is full width. If we had a larger monitor, you get this, like everything's still in a container, which is what we want, but the design is full width. You see how that SVG, looks really good still. That background is still flesh left, from edge to edge of the screen. So it's responsive so far. The next week too, besides animations, we'll make sure that this is mobile responsive. So right now, if I were to check this on my phone, it wouldn't look good, but that's an extra step, obviously. And we'll go through that next week. All right, so let's go ahead and break out the schedule. We're almost there, guys, we're almost there. And we're gonna, just to be a little faster, I'm gonna copy these. I'm gonna indent the schedule. I'm gonna close the div and close the section. So this is schedule. And my H2 doesn't need anything anymore. All right. So I broke that out from the main container, and just to save time, I'm gonna go ahead and get the styles from the repository that I already have. Cool. So now with the styles that I added, I basically made a gradient. So where this section started, it uses that pink color. So notice that that's where the speaker section has. So there's a really good transition from that. And the gradient goes from that pink to that blue. And the next section is blue. So again, it transitions good. The title, I went ahead and made it pretty big, as just like the speaker section, but it's not in caps, and made the list group have a max width, so that way it's not super wide, and made, just mess with some background colors, things like that. I think I want to change, so yeah, so you get the point, what I did there. That's basically what the big changes on the schedule. The next piece is this call to action button, so call to action obviously is very important. So that's where we want people to visually see. So we want to drive traffic to that. So this right now doesn't do that. It just is a big button. So we're going to go ahead and do the same concept. We're going to break it out of the container. And I think I'm just going to copy the code. So this is a CSS for it, which once I create that section for it, I have another pattern. It's called pattern waves. It's an SVG file. And it's a very simple wave image to that. And you'll see the cool way it makes it stand out. So let me grab the HTML just to save time. Okay, so doing that change does this. So that's that pattern, this blue pattern right here, the waves. And I have a background color of this darker blue. That's all that background does. So if I change that to, let's just say, I don't know, something crazy like red. Oh, wrong one. So that way you can see where the image is at, where that SVG. So that the SVG is this blue wave pattern there. And I have a background color of a darker blue that's behind that, essentially. So that's all it is. That's what gives it that effect. So now as I'm scrolling, like, there's no way you can miss this. All right, so the last piece is the footer. Same concept, we're gonna break it out of the container div. I'm gonna just copy and paste the code just to save time. My section footer, and I'm gonna go ahead and copy the CSS for that. It's not much. Just basically removed those horizontal rules, and then made the text white and some opacity and things like that in there. Yeah, so that's basically it. This is how we took that, that prototype design, that layout. Again, we were able to build that with Bootstrap very quickly. And the next step is just being creative, which is what you want to do. So this looks nothing like what it did before, and that's what you want. You definitely, so Bootstrap is not a tool where you're going to design your websites around. It has all the components. So like, your buttons, the copy, nav bar, columns, I use the card component. I use the list group component. So it has really cool components, but, definitely step out of the box and do experiment with what you can do with them. Also, obviously, keep in mind the browsers don't go too crazy because, unless that's your target audience. If your target audience they don't use Internet Explorer, you should be fine. But if you're going to be targeting the general audience, you want to make sure that they have a version of your website that is readable. So if certain, like for example, the drop shadow, let's just say that didn't work on Internet Explorer, it's fine. You know, if someone's on an Internet Explorer and they see this design, they just didn't see the drop shadow. It doesn't hurt anything. It's not horrible. The client should not be upset about it. You know, but so that's okay. You know, now if the picture didn't show, you know, then that's a problem, right? Because, you know, the image is not showing. But little stylistic things that don't work on older browsers, and it's not obstructing or it's not affecting the website visually or just, you know, just reading wise, then, you know, you should not consider that a problem. For example, these waves, for example, the SVG didn't work on Internet Explorer today, and you just saw a blue background, a darker blue. The darker blue still would have worked, you know. It would have still caught my eye, you know. So it's not the end of the world for certain things that where you experiment with. Yeah, so I'll leave it up for, you know, just any questions that you might have, and we can go from there.
With this, I know I tried downloading SASS on my computer with Homebrew, and I don't know if it went through because I got the same error message as Francine.
Oh, yes, let me look at that. I think it'll be fine. So I think it just might be a different message, or they changed the version, how to check for the version. You can try --v. It's like SASS and then space --v. Or actually, let me see this selection. Yeah. So do SASS space -- version, and this should work actually. So maybe it's just outdated command line, the -v. Usually this works for most command line applications. So just seeing that if you're seeing the same thing that
Oh, okay,
that
it works
Francine is
now.
seeing, yeah, right. Okay, yeah. So if you're seeing the same thing that Francine was seeing, then you're fine because it's actually showing you the SASS message there.
Yeah, it says like version 1.19.
Perfect. Yeah. So if you do the same thing, change directory to your repository, and then run and also on Canvas, I went ahead and added those steps to what we're talking about. So under the assignment, so here are the things that I would like for you to do, which is create a branch, to call it SASS. That way you're working on a different branch for this work. Everything that we talked about in the beginning of the workshop, which is like create a SCSS directory, renaming your style CSS into SCSS, all that is all there as well for reference.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Daniel. Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly what's going to happen. Like the more you work on it, the like anything, right? So the more you work on it, the better you'll get. Yeah. So hopefully this helps. You know, with seeing the possibility and what you should do from using Bootstrap or any framework to make it your own, how to customize it with what you want to do.
It did help a lot. Thank you a lot for your time because it helps to visualize it.
But yeah, so y'all have the assignment that's there, and the quiz is very easy, and you know, I'm available if y'all have any more questions.